There's an author, you'll know his name. You may even have one of his books on your shelf. You may even have read one. Very successful. And one day he was sitting there at his desk reading a letter from his publisher, telling him how many books he had sold that month and how much money was coming in. And he was very pleased. Everything was going swimmingly. But of course it hadn't always been like that. In fact, he had struggled to be the successful author that he was today. He'd tried writing biographies, detective stories, romance, all sorts of stuff. And out of sheer desperation, he started to write about an event that had taken place in the 1970s when he was 13 and on holiday at a campsite with his parents in Dorset. And there he met up with some other boys, and they would muck about and do all sorts of things, all of the same age. In fact, there were 6 of them in total. And there was one thing that kept them in common with each other. They all wanted to be rich and they all wanted to be famous. One of those boys, and the author couldn't remember whom exactly, had come up with this strange scheme. And this may sound a bit bizarre, but what you did was you took a bit of hair, cut it into a tuft, wrap it with a elastic band and place it into an old tobacco tin, very much like this one. Put it inside, and then on an agreed day, which happened to be the 30th of July, you would sneak into the rich man's house in your locality, somebody who had ultimate wealth, bury it in the garden, deep down where it would never be found. And by that process, a weird osmosis would happen, that in time that boy would become rich and successful. And each of the boys, being 13 back in the 1970s, were naive enough to think that this would really work. But they only knew each other on first name terms, and they were scattered about the country. So they agreed on this one date that they would do it. And they knew by having a pact that they would each go out and do this. The author looked at the cover of his book and thought how marvellous it was that he was as successful as he was today. The book had been taken all over the world and all sorts of people were reading it. And as the months and weeks and years went by, over that time, different people would get in touch. But what the author found particularly interesting was those old boys that he met back then in the 70s got in touch, and each one telling them that they were famous for something. One was the CEO of a pharmaceutical company, another was a very successful merchant banker, a third was a brain surgeon. They were important, they had big houses, they had swimming pools and tennis courts, they had done very well for themselves. It's interesting because he kept these letters apart and noticed that out of the 6, himself and 4 others had been in touch, there was one that hadn't. He looked at the names and he remembered, yes, his name was Ginge. That's all we knew, Ginge or Ginger, because of course of his red hair. Wonder what happened to him. Then one day in the post, a letter arrived, well, a parcel really, and with it a letter, and he opened it up, and it was from a very important lord, somebody who actually was sitting in the House of Lords, and he said, I won't mention his name, of course, but he said, I've been reading your book. It's absolutely fascinating because, strangely enough, some years ago, one of my gardeners was tending to the roses or the flower bed somewhere and dug up a tobacco tin with a tuft of hair in it. We thought it was a bit macabre at first, but we didn't know what to do with it. We were going to toss it out, but we kept it for some unknown reason as a sort of memento. And then, reading your book, we realised that this might be one of your group. So I've enclosed it for you to determine. And the author opened it up and looked at the tin, and he opened it up, and sure enough, inside was this tuft of red hair. Ginge, he thought. The one boy who hadn't been in touch. And then he had an idea. Wouldn't it be great, he thought, to do a follow-up book, a book in which he traced whatever happened to Ginger. Ginger must surely be very rich and very famous, and everybody would know, and it would be a kind of expose. So excited was he contacted the other members of his pact, who were now all grown up, and said, listen, I've got this plan. Let's do it. They all agreed. So pulling a few strings here and there, the only way he could try to contact this boy, because he had no idea who he was in real life, because he only had this one name, was he used the process of DNA to see if that would help to profile who he might be. Bizarrely, the report that came back was that he was a prisoner. A prisoner, the police had him on their records. He was a prisoner at Rochester Jail in Kent. This came as a huge surprise, not only to the author, but to the others. And one of the others said, well, we must go and see him. We must go and cheer him up. It must be dreadful. I wonder why he's in jail. What has he done? So they gathered themselves together on one particular day and arrived at Rochester Jail. With special permission, they had arranged for them to meet Ginger. And in this very bleak grey room there was one table, and Ginger sat on one side and the other 5 boys, well, now men of course, sat on the other side. And they looked at Ginger, and he looked thin and wiry and in a terrible state. And they said, Ginger, it's lovely to meet you, but whatever's happened? Oh, I've had a terrible time of it, said Ginger. I've tried to make my way in the world, but I just haven't been able to. Everything I've done has turned against me, and in the end I've had to rob and embezzle and use fraud, and look where I am. And the 5 looked at each other and they thought, this is so sad. And they explained what success they had, that they had been the masters of their career, they had great wealth, and they would do anything to help Ginger. But of course, he was in prison, he had to serve his time. And then the author produced the tobacco tin and said, Ginge, I've been contacted by somebody who dug this up in their garden. It's remarkable because there it is, there's your hair, and it's such a shame it didn't work for you. But the author was a little bit uncomfortable at that moment, because he said, look, Ginge, I don't know if this is going to make you feel a bit better, but to be honest with you, when I got home from that holiday and I had that tobacco tin and I looked at the hair, I did think actually burying this in a rich man's garden was a bit far-fetched. To be honest with you, I thought it was a load of cobblers, and I didn't do it. And Ginge looked at him and thought, well, it's blow me. At that point, the other 4 started to feel a little bit uncomfortable too. And one by one, from a pocket, they produced a tobacco tin. And opening it up, sure enough, was their tuft of hair. And each one confessed that they actually also thought it was a silly scheme and hadn't done it. And Ginge looked at them in turn and went, what? Are you telling me that none of you went into a rich man's garden, climbed over the fence on the 30th of July and dug a hole and put it down in the ground? And I'm the only one who did that, and now I'm in clink? And it seemed to the 6 of them sitting there that the scheme was, in fact, the wrong way round. That to go and bury your hair in somebody else's garden, which is probably illegal anyway, was to bring bad luck on you. And Ginge was proof of that.